welcome back to the Room of Acquirement. As always, I'm Curtis, your curator to this magical collection, and today we're going to be picking up where we left off on Horcruxes. So if you didn't see the last episode, spoiler alert. Now, let's get down to business. Last time we talked about Tom Riddle as a young man, how he grew up in an orphanage, and we covered the first two Horcruxes that he created, being the Ring of Marvel-O-Gaunt and Tom Riddle's diary. Now, we know that Tom graduated from Hogwarts in 1945, but what a lot of people don't realize is that after he graduated, he went and worked at Borgin & Burke's. In 1956, a woman named Hepzibah Smith, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, went into Borgin & Burke's and purchased the Goblet of Helga Hufflepuff and the Locket of Salazar Slytherin. Voldemort coveted these items, and so he murdered Hepzibah Smith and framed her house elf. He used that murder to transform Helga Hufflepuff's goblet into his next Horcrux. Later on, in 1957, he murdered a lowly muggle in order to turn the locket into his next Horcrux. Then, although he learned of its location in 1944 from the Grey Lady, Helena Ravenclaw, Voldemort finally made the trip to Albania in 1967 to retrieve the lost diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw. Once he had managed to find the diadem hidden within a dark forest, he killed a lowly peasant of Albania in order to create the diadem Horcrux. After he created it, he returned to Hogwarts with the hope of gaining the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher position. His goal was ultimately to raise an army of young witches and wizards and train them up in the dark arts. But Dumbledore, being the headmaster at the time, saw through what Tom had planned to do and refused to grant him the position. As a result, Voldemort cast a curse on the Defense Against the Dark Arts position, and from that point onward, no professor was capable of keeping the job for more than a single year. While Voldemort was at Hogwarts, however, he made a quick stop by the Room of Requirements so that he could hide the diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw within Hogwarts walls. Finally, after years of building his forces, Voldemort went after his enemies. In 1981, Voldemort finally caught up to the Potter family, and after killing Lily and James Potter, he attempted to kill their son, Harry, only to have it backfire. When this happened, not only did Harry become an unwitting Horcrux, but Voldemort himself was now disembodied as a mere parasite and was forced to retreat to the forests of Albania, which he knew had plenty of unicorns. He also knew that drinking their blood would be enough to sustain him, and so for 10 years he inhabited the bodies of many different magical beasts as a parasite, feeding off of the blood of unicorns to sustain him. It wasn't until Quirrell had visited Albania that he was finally able to return to Hogwarts, as we see him in the first year. After Voldemort had been thwarted by Harry during his first year at Hogwarts, Voldemort eventually took on the form of what appears to be a shriveled husk of a man, much frailer and weaker than his natural body. However, still strong enough to commit murder. And so, in 1994, Voldemort carried out the murder of Bertha Jorkins and created his final Horcrux, Nagini. For those of you who don't know about Nagini, she was once a human woman with a much kinder disposition than the snake that she eventually became. This transformation, of course, was not by her choice, but the result of a magical disease that forced her into that form. So, now that we've talked about all the different Horcruxes, you're bound to be asking yourself quite a few questions, such as, how did Voldemort survive at all when he attacked Harry? Well, we're about to dive into some of that. So let us go over what is required in order to create a Horcrux in the first place. According to the research that I've done, 3 things need to be done in order for a successful Horcrux to be made. The first, as everyone knows, murder must be committed in order to split the soul. Number 2, dark magic is required to prepare the soul fragment, as I like to call it, to be transferred from the body to the object that the caster has chosen to create a Horcrux in. Lastly, a horrific act which is unspecified needs to be carried out in order to transfer the soul from one person to the object. Now, if these 3 steps are required to create a Horcrux, many people will immediately see a problem with Harry Potter. Hence, there's a lot of speculation as to whether or not he is a true Horcrux. Furthermore, many people have speculated as to what dark magic and horrific act are required in order to make a Horcrux. While we do not know what dark magic or what horrific act are required to make a Horcrux, we do know that, given the time constraints, Voldemort would have had a very difficult time performing that kind of a ritual the night that he attempted to kill Harry Potter. Harry seems to be the exception to the rule on how to create a Horcrux. So, what exactly happened that night in Godric's Hollow for these special circumstances to take place? Let's go with the fan theory that the horrific act that needs to be done is cannibalism. If cannibalism is the horrific act, which I personally find it difficult to believe, which I'll get into in a moment, then all Voldemort needs to do is take a bite out of his victims in order to ensure that he can create a Horcrux. Doesn't seem too difficult, and yet it is grotesque enough to throw some people off, and as such, J.K. Rowling may not have wanted to include that in her writings. But why be so tight-lipped about it years later? Well, I think I figured out why. If cannibalism is in fact the horrific act that needs to be committed, here are the problems with that. Even though it works for every other Horcrux, it just doesn't when it comes to Harry. The reason being is, when Voldemort arrives at the Potter's house, we're going to assume that he's only got one soul in him at that particular time. Now, the reason why I'm making this assumption is, near the beginning of his crusade to create these Horcruxes, he killed multiple people and yet was only able to create one Horcrux per murder. And yet, even though he killed 3 people to start with, he only created the one Horcrux. This leads me to believe that given enough time the soul may in fact mend itself. If that's the case, Voldemort could have arrived at the Potters with only the one soul fragment within him. When he entered the Potter residence, however, he would have killed James, splitting his soul once into 2 pieces, and then when he killed Lily, it would have split again into 3 pieces. Here's where it gets interesting. When he tries to attack Harry, his curse rebounds right at him. Now, seeing as he has 3 soul fragments within him, this explains how he was able to survive at all. When he attacked Harry and his spell Rebound, 1 soul fragment took the entire brunt of the blast. And assuming he had prepared to create a Horcrux that night, one of his soul fragments may have been protected from the blast. And seeing as he was now dead, the soul fragment may have bypassed the 3rd and final step required to properly create a Horcrux, thereby allowing it to latch on to the only living thing it could find. The only problem with this is, if Voldemort prepared to create a Horcrux, one would assume that he would at least suspect that Harry himself had become a Horcrux. The fact that he wasn't able to suspect this leads me to believe that he didn't prepare to create a Horcrux at all, and Dumbledore even says that Harry was the Horcrux that Voldemort never intended to create. Lastly, his 3rd soul fragment, with no body to return to, and nowhere to go, had retreated and lived in the forests of Albania. So, here we seem to have a bit of a problem. Not only does it seem less likely that Voldemort would have prepared to create a Horcrux that night, but he wouldn't have had the time to go about the 3rd and final step required to create a Horcrux either. Unless, of course, his death does allow for some sort of loophole. But the only hole I'm seeing in all this, and I hate to say this about the Harry Potter franchise, is a plot hole. And I think that may in fact be the reason why J.K. Rowling doesn't want to talk about the Horcrux. However, I have no proof of this. It's entirely possible that Voldemort may have prepared to create another Horcrux, but never intended it to be Harry Potter, and as such, just never expected that Harry had become a Horcrux. Either way, this is a question that a lot of people have wanted answers to. How do you make a Horcrux? And now, even though we have a general guideline of the 3 steps required, and great fan theories about what the horrific act would be for step 3, well, it just doesn't add up. You see, in the Goblet of Fire, we see far worse than cannibalism. How? Through Voldemort's resurrection. In that scene, we see Voldemort get tossed into a cauldron of a bubbling potion over a massive fire. We then see Peter Pettigrew throw in a bone from his father, and then Pettigrew cuts off his own hand and adds it to the mix before using a knife to harvest blood from Harry Potter and put it into the cauldron as well. This then creates this dark resurrection ceremony that brings back the Dark Lord. Forgive me for saying, but I think that resurrection ceremony is a lot darker than any amount of cannibalism. So, although I like the fan theory of cannibalism, I don't see that as being grotesque enough for J.K. Rowling to omit from the story. I do believe that a plot hole in the story is therefore the real reason why she is keeping so quiet about how Horcruxes are made. In any case, I hope that you've enjoyed this dive into the darkest magic of the wizarding world. So, to wrap things up, I'm really looking forward to seeing what kind of fan theories that you guys have, so put them down in the comments section below so I can go over them, and if you come up with a good enough fan theory about Horcruxes that fits not only with all the other 6 Horcruxes, but also has that little loophole that we can work in for Harry Potter, I'd be very interested to hear it. In any case, I do hope that you will share some of your fan theories with me, and I also want you to take a good look at this collection before you go, so that you can pick out an item that hasn't been talked about yet. We've only just begun, folks, so let me know what items you're interested in, and most popular item wins for the next episode. Don't forget to spell the like, subscribe, and bell so that you don't miss a magical moment on the Room of Acquirement. Until then, Avada Kedavra!